The story of the White House begins in 1790 when the newly formed United States was searching for a permanent capital. The Residence Act, signed by President George Washington, established a federal district along the Potomac River. Washington selected the exact location for the capital city and designated a site for the president's house. In 1792, a public design competition was announced to find an architect for the president's mansion. Irish-born architect James Hoban won the competition with a neoclassical design inspired by Leinster House in Dublin. President Washington oversaw the selection personally, although he never lived in the White House. Construction began on October 13, 1792, using mostly enslaved laborers, European craftsmen, and local workers. The cornerstone was laid that same day, marking the beginning of what would become an iconic symbol of American democracy. The building was originally referred to as the President's Palace or the President's House. It was constructed using white-painted Aquia Creek sandstone, which gave it its distinctive appearance. Progress was slow due to limited funds and manpower, and construction stretched on for 8 years. The first floor and outer walls were mostly complete by the late 1790s, but interior work was still ongoing. Although President Washington supervised the planning and design, it was John Adams who first moved in. On November 1, 1800, Adams and his wife, Abigail, became the mansion's first official residence. They found it unfinished and cold, with many rooms still incomplete or unfurnished. Abigail Adams famously used the East Room to hang laundry due to the lack of adequate drying space. Despite its unfinished state, the move marked the beginning of the White House as the official presidential residence. Early records show that the house contained only a few furnishings and minimal decoration at the time. The structure was large and imposing, meant to project the power and dignity of the presidency. The original building had no electricity, running water, or central heating, only fireplaces for warmth. Much of the early work was done by hand, including carving decorative moldings and laying bricks. Hoban continued working on the project after Adams moved in, improving and finishing interior details. By the time Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801, the White House was still evolving. Jefferson added personal touches, including maps, scientific instruments, and classical artwork. He also created the first landscape design for the White House grounds, adding walkways and gardens. Although the structure remained modest compared to European palaces, it embodied American ideals of leadership and republicanism. The early years of the White House reflected a new nation's attempt to define its identity. It stood as a political statement, a house for a president, not a king. The foundation laid in these formative years set the stage for what the White House would become. When John Adams moved into the White House in 1800, the building was far from complete. Only a handful of rooms were furnished, and much of the structure remained under construction. Despite its condition, Adams wrote a prayer wishing that none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. Abigail Adams struggled with the unfinished surroundings, using makeshift areas for daily tasks like laundry and food preparation. The White House was cold and drafty, with no insulation and limited heating options. Adams only lived there for a few months before Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801. Jefferson, who was deeply interested in architecture, made several modifications to the mansion. He added colonnades to connect the main house to service buildings on each side. Jefferson also expanded the gardens and introduced indoor innovations like a revolving bookstand. He used the White House not only as a residence, but as a working hub for his intellectual and political interests. During his time, the White House became more functional and more aligned with Republican ideals. In 1809, James Madison became the fourth president and moved into the White House with his wife, Dolly Madison. Dolly played a key role in shaping the social life of the White House, hosting formal events and receptions. She helped define the role of the First Lady, turning the White House into a center of Washington society. Under Madison, the White House continued to evolve, but dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Tensions with Britain escalated into the War of 1812, threatening the nation's capital. In August 1814, British forces marched into Washington, D.C. after defeating American troops at the Battle of Bladensburg. As the British advanced, Dolly Madison famously refused to flee until she had saved important state documents and a portrait of George Washington. She escaped just in time as British troops entered the city. That night, the British set fire to multiple government buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. The blaze gutted the interior, leaving only the charred exterior walls standing. The once symbolic home of the president was now a blackened shell. Despite the devastation, the fire became a rallying cry for American resilience. The public demanded that the White House be rebuilt, on the same site, preserving its role as the seat of the presidency. James Hoban, the original architect, was called back to lead the reconstruction. The rebuilding began almost immediately, using the surviving exterior walls as a foundation. Hoban worked to restore the original design while improving structural weaknesses exposed by the fire. President Madison and Congress operated from temporary quarters during the Reconstruction. Though slow, the rebuilding effort symbolized a national desire to maintain continuity and identity. The charred remains of the White House were cleaned, reinforced, and slowly brought back to life. The War of 1812 had proven that even the heart of American government could be attacked. Yet the commitment to restore the White House demonstrated the young nation's resolve. By 1817, when James Monroe took office, the restored White House was ready to be used once again. It had survived fire, war, and political uncertainty and stood as a renewed symbol of the American Republic. When James Monroe became president in 1817, he was the first to occupy the fully restored White House after the War of 1812. The Reconstruction had taken 3 years, restoring much of James Hoban's original neoclassical design. Monroe added elegant furnishings imported from France to replace items lost in the fire. His administration sought to restore the dignity of the presidency and make the White House a symbol of national unity. The interiors reflected a blend of European influence and American ideals. Monroe hosted grand receptions and state dinners, reinforcing the role of the White House in diplomacy. In the 1820s, the south portico was added under Hoban's direction, giving the southern façade its distinctive rounded form. The addition was modeled after classical European architecture, enhancing the building's formal symmetry. During John Quincy Adams's presidency, the focus shifted toward landscaping and outdoor improvements. Adams loved gardening and directed the planting of trees and flower beds around the White House grounds. He even proposed building an astronomical observatory nearby, which earned him the nickname the Astronomer President. Although Congress rejected the idea, Adams's interest reflected an effort to associate the presidency with knowledge and science. Andrew Jackson took office in 1829 and brought dramatic changes to both the presidency and the White House. He opened the mansion to the public, inviting thousands to his inauguration party, which led to chaos and damage inside. As a populist, Jackson wanted the White House to reflect the voice of the people rather than elite traditions. He made practical renovations, including installing running water and heating systems. Jackson also oversaw the construction of the North Portico in 1830, completing the iconic north entrance. This addition balanced the White House's architecture and provided a formal space for receiving guests. During Jackson's time, the White House became a center of fierce political activity and controversy, used the executive mansion to strengthen presidential authority, hosting intense meetings with allies and opponents. The public's access to the White House was expanded, but security and order became more difficult to manage. The 1830s and 1840s also saw the White House used for large public events and social functions. Presidents Martin Van Buren and William Henry Harrison continued to use the space for political networking. Harrison, however, served only 31 days in office, the shortest presidency in U.S. history, before dying of pneumonia. John Tyler, his successor, faced controversy over the legitimacy of his presidency and held tense meetings inside the White House. The White House became a symbol of constitutional interpretation during the Tyler administration. Later, James K. Polk used the building to conduct the expansionist policies of Manifest Destiny. He met with advisors in the Oval Rooms to discuss the annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico. Under Polk, the White House was used to consolidate executive power and influence foreign policy. As the 1850s approached, tensions over slavery and statehood grew, and debates echoed through the halls of the executive mansion. The White House stood not only as a home for presidents, but as the epicenter of a growing, divided republic. Its walls had seen celebration and scandal, unity and division, all while expanding alongside the nation it represented. By the 1850s, America was deeply divided over the issue of slavery, and this conflict echoed through the White House. President Millard Fillmore tried to maintain balance by supporting the Compromise of 1850, which aimed to ease sectional tensions. The White House became a place where uneasy truces were negotiated, but the peace was temporary. Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, the next two presidents, struggled to control the rising tensions. During their terms, Southern states grew more defiant, and abolitionists grew more determined. The White House witnessed debates, petitions, and protests that foreshadowed the coming conflict. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, sparking the secession of Southern states. Lincoln arrived in Washington under tight security, with fears of assassination already looming. The White House became a fortress, surrounded by troops as the Civil War erupted in 1861. Inside its halls, Lincoln faced the greatest crisis in the nation's history. He used the executive mansion as his base for planning military strategy and preserving the Union. Many late nights were spent in the library and cabinet room, working with generals and political leaders. Mary Todd Lincoln faced criticism for hosting social events during wartime, seen by some as inappropriate. However, she believed such gatherings maintained morale and dignity during dark times. The White House also became a site of grief. As the Lincolns lost their young son Willie in 1862, the president himself aged rapidly, burdened by the war's toll on the nation. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, redefining the war as a fight against slavery. He welcomed black leaders and Union soldiers into the White House, signaling a new era of inclusion. As Union forces turned the tide of war, Lincoln planned for national reconciliation and healing. But his vision was cut short. On April 14, 1865, just days after the Confederate surrender, Lincoln was assassinated. The White House was plunged into mourning, draped in black cloth and filled with silence. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency and faced the enormous task of Reconstruction. Johnson clashed with Congress over how to reunify the nation and protect the rights of freed slaves. His approach was lenient toward the South, which sparked fierce opposition. The White House became a battleground between executive and legislative power. Johnson's combative style and vetoes led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1868. Though he was acquitted in the Senate, the episode damaged the authority of the presidency. In 1869, Ulysses S. Grant took office and brought stability to the White House. A former Union general, Grant used his position to support civil rights and Reconstruction policies. He invited black leaders and international diplomats to the White House, signaling a shift in American identity. During Grant's presidency, the building also saw improvements. In technology and security, gaslighting replaced candles, and modern plumbing was expanded throughout the mansion. But political scandals and economic troubles weakened Grant's administration. By the mid-1870s, Northern support for Reconstruction waned. In 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes entered the White House after a highly contested election. He withdrew federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The White House reflected a return to political compromise, but also the abandonment of civil rights protections. As the 19th century neared its close, the executive mansion stood as a witness to both the nation's deepest wounds and its determined efforts to heal. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, the White House entered a new era defined by industry, wealth, and political transformation. President Rutherford B. Hayes sought to restore the image of the presidency by limiting patronage and corruption. He opened the White House to visitors and held receptions to rebuild public trust in government. The executive mansion remained relatively unchanged during his term, but its symbolic role grew stronger. Hayes used the White House to support civil service reform and racial equality. Though with limited success, James A. Garfield followed in 1881 but was assassinated only months into his term. His death shocked the nation and heightened calls for political reform. Chester A. Arthur, his successor, unexpectedly embraced change and signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883. Arthur also renovated the White House's interior, adding modern plumbing, gas fixtures, and stylish furnishings. He hired Louis Comfort Tiffany to redesign the entrance hall with stained glass and vibrant colors. These renovations introduced a more decorative, artistic tone to the executive mansion. During Grover Cleveland's 2 non-consecutive terms, the White House saw further modernization. Electric lights were installed in 1891, although Cleveland and his wife were initially afraid to use them. Benjamin Harrison, who served between Cleveland's terms, added electricity throughout the building, but kept gas lighting as a backup. Harrison also introduced Christmas traditions at the White House, including the first decorated tree. In this period, presidents used the mansion for ceremonial duties, but had limited legislative power. The growing influence of corporations and industrialists often overshadowed presidential authority. As the Gilded Age progressed, criticisms of inequality and corruption grew louder. The White House remained a symbol of government, but was also seen as disconnected from ordinary Americans. In 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency. At age 42, Roosevelt became the youngest president and brought new energy to the White House. He viewed the executive mansion as both a stage for leadership and a place for reform. Roosevelt quickly began renovations to adapt the White House to modern government needs. In 1902, he commissioned architect Charles McKim to redesign the building's interior and expand office space. The West Wing was constructed for the first time, separating the president's office from the family residence. The new West Wing gave the presidency a more professional and structured working environment. Roosevelt removed Victorian decorations and restored the neoclassical style of James Hoban's original design. His changes reflected a return to simplicity and dignity, as well as a desire to connect to the founders. Roosevelt used the White House as a center of progressive policies, including trust-busting and conservation. He invited civil rights leader Booker T. Washington to dine at the mansion, a controversial act at the time. This sparked public debate but marked an important moment in White House history regarding race relations. Roosevelt's presidency elevated the visibility and authority of the White House as never before. In 1909, William Howard Taft succeeded Roosevelt and continued expanding the presidential workspace. He enlarged the West Wing and created the first permanent Oval Office. Taft's renovations reflected the increasing responsibilities of the modern presidency. By the time Taft left office in 1913, the White House had been transformed into both a home and a hub of executive power. Its appearance had evolved, but its central role in American democracy remained firmly intact. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson entered the White House, bringing academic intellect and progressive ideals to the presidency. He believed the White House should lead the nation morally as well as politically. Wilson hosted lectures, discussions, and diplomatic receptions that reflected his scholarly background. As World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, Wilson initially kept the U.S. neutral. Inside the White House, he wrestled with growing pressure from allies and the public. In 1917, after repeated German provocations, Wilson asked Congress to declare war. The White House became a command center for mobilizing the American economy and military. Wilson signed key wartime legislation from his desk and addressed the nation from the East Room. He also crafted his Vision for Post-War Peace, the 14 points, inside the mansion. After the war, Wilson traveled to Europe for the Paris Peace Conference, leaving the White House in the hands of aides. Upon returning, he suffered a debilitating stroke and governed in isolation from his private quarters. His wife, Edith Wilson, unofficially managed many presidential duties, making the White House a seat of quiet power. In 1921, Warren G. Harding took office, promising a return to normalcy. The White House resumed hosting grand parties and state dinners, reflecting a more relaxed era. But Harding's term was marred by scandals like the Teapot Dome affair, which stained the presidency. Calvin Coolidge assumed office after Harding's sudden death and brought restraint to the executive mansion. Coolidge rarely entertained and kept a strict schedule, turning the White House into a place of quiet governance. He believed in small government and used the mansion mostly as a symbol of national stability. In 1929, Herbert Hoover moved in just months before the stock market crash. The Great Depression soon enveloped the nation, and the White House became a focal point for criticism. Hoover avoided public appearances and was seen as distant and ineffective. He added a telephone system and improved the West Wing, but public confidence in the presidency eroded. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office, bringing bold leadership and the New Deal to the White House. Despite being paralyzed from polio, FDR exuded confidence and optimism from within the mansion. He held fireside chats over radio, directly addressing the American people from the White House. The executive mansion became the center of sweeping economic reforms and relief programs. Roosevelt created numerous agencies and signed vital legislation within its walls. Eleanor Roosevelt redefined the role of First Lady, holding press conferences and championing civil rights. She hosted activists, writers, and world leaders in the White House, turning it into a hub of progressive ideas. As World War II erupted, the White House once again shifted into wartime mode. FDR established the White House Map Room to monitor global developments. He held secret meetings with military leaders and foreign diplomats, including Winston Churchill. The mansion was tightly secured, with blackout curtains and air raid drills becoming routine. FDR used the Oval Office to rally the nation after Pearl Harbor and maintain morale during wartime. He expanded the West Wing, further to accommodate new offices and war councils. Despite failing health, Roosevelt ran for and won a fourth term in 1944. He continued leading the Allied strategy from inside the White House. But on April 12, 1945, just months before the war's end, FDR died in office. Harry S. Truman was suddenly sworn in, inheriting the weight of global conflict. The White House entered the atomic age as Truman authorized the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II ended later that year, and the executive mansion once again shifted from war to peace. The White House had evolved into a true command center. More than a home, it was now the global nerve center of American power. After World War II, the White House quickly became the epicenter of Cold War decisions. President Truman faced mounting tensions with the Soviet Union and responded with the Truman Doctrine in 1947. He announced it from the White House, committing American support to nations resisting communism. Inside the executive mansion, key meetings laid the groundwork for the Marshall Plan. Truman also approved the formation of NATO while working from the Oval Office. In 1948, the White House was a hub of activity during the Berlin airlift crisis. Truman coordinated with military leaders and gave press briefings from within the mansion, but the White House itself was deteriorating structurally due to decades of wear. In 1948, engineers warned it was in danger of collapse. By 1949, Truman and his family moved across the street to Blair House, and the White House underwent a complete interior reconstruction. the interior was gutted, leaving only the outer walls standing. For 3 years, workers rebuilt the interior with steel beams and modern systems. Truman occasionally visited to inspect progress, and he moved back in 1952. He marked the return by delivering a speech from the newly rebuilt Blue Room. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower took office, bringing military discipline to the White House. He used it as a command post during key Cold War. Moments like the Korean Armistice and Suez Crisis. Eisenhower also opened the White House to public tours and held televised addresses. During his presidency, the first official White House press room was established. In 1957, the mansion became a focal point for civil rights debates after the Little Rock crisis. Eisenhower ordered federal troops to Arkansas and addressed the nation from the Oval Office. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected and brought a youthful energy to the executive mansion. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, restored the White House interiors with historic furniture and art. She gave a televised tour in 1962, showcasing the restoration and emphasizing the building's heritage. JFK held frequent meetings in the cabinet room during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The mansion became a nerve center as the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy addressed the nation live from the Oval Office, urging calm and resolve. The successful resolution of the crisis elevated the White House's image as a symbol of global leadership. Kennedy also welcomed civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. into the White House. These meetings laid the groundwork for federal action on civil rights. But tragedy struck on November 22, 1963, when JFK was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One, then returned to Washington to lead a grieving nation. The White House became a place of both mourning and rapid legislative activity. Johnson used his time there to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He signed these historic laws in the East Room with civil rights leaders by his side. Johnson also expanded the Great Society programs from within the mansion's walls. He hosted war councils during the escalating Vietnam conflict, often pacing the halls late at night. Protests erupted outside the White House as public opinion on Vietnam shifted. By the late 1960s, the executive mansion symbolized both power and controversy. In 1968, anti-war demonstrations filled Lafayette Square across from the White House. Inside, Johnson decided not to seek re-election, exhausted by the burdens of war and social unrest. As the decade ended, the White House stood at the crossroads of a changing America. It had become a battleground for policy, protest, and the pursuit of civil rights. In the 1970s, the White House entered a new era of political upheaval and media scrutiny. President Richard Nixon's administration saw the executive mansion become the focal point of the Watergate scandal. Secret recordings made in the Oval Office later became central evidence. As investigations intensified, Nixon delivered several televised statements from within the White House. The nation watched as trust in the presidency declined. In August 1974, Nixon became the first president to resign, announcing it from the White House. He boarded a helicopter on the South Lawn, waving farewell in a historic and somber moment. Vice President Gerald Ford assumed office and declared, "Our long national nightmare is over," from the East Room. The White House began working to restore public confidence. In 1976, Jimmy Carter brought a humble, down-to-earth tone to the mansion. He walked down Pennsylvania Avenue during his inauguration rather than taking a car. Carter also installed solar panels on the White House roof to promote energy awareness, held regular fireside chats from the Oval Office to connect with the public. The 1980s ushered in a more assertive style under President Ronald Reagan. Reagan revitalized the ceremonial aspects of the White House with elegant state dinners and formal receptions. He addressed the nation from the Oval Office during the Challenger disaster in 1986, providing calm leadership. First Lady Nancy Reagan refurbished many rooms, restoring grandeur to the mansion. In 1989, George H.W. Bush continued traditional diplomacy, hosting world leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev at the White House. He initiated key discussions on the end of the Cold War within its historic rooms. With the 1990s came technological upgrades under President Bill Clinton. The White House saw the introduction of email systems, improved security protocols, and a new press briefing room. Clinton also used the Rose Garden for frequent speeches and announcements. In 1998, the White House faced scandal again during the Lewinsky affair. Clinton made his now famous address from the White House, stating he did not have sexual relations with that woman. Despite the controversy, the institution endured. In 2001, George W. Bush faced one of the greatest crises in U.S. history, the September 11th attacks. From the Oval Office, he addressed a shocked nation with resolve and reassurance. Security around the White House intensified drastically following the attacks. Concrete barriers, sharpshooters, and restricted airspace became standard. Bush also used the White House as a command center during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2009, Barack Obama became the first African-American president and brought a new chapter to the White House. He emphasized transparency, holding online Q&As from inside the mansion. Michelle Obama promoted healthy eating and created a vegetable garden on the South Lawn. The Obamas modernized the residence further with green technology and cultural events. In 2017, Donald Trump's presidency marked a period of intense political polarization. The White House became the stage for heated press briefings and frequent social media announcements. Trump held summits with foreign leaders like Kim Jong-un, often using the White House as a backdrop. Security was tightened even more during major protests in 2020, including the George Floyd demonstrations. The White House was temporarily surrounded by tall fences and patrolled heavily. In 2021, Joe Biden assumed office during a global pandemic and national tension. His inauguration was scaled down and protected by military personnel following the Capitol riot. Biden immediately signed executive orders inside the Oval Office on climate, health, and equality. The White House adapted to the digital age with live-streamed briefings and remote events. Through triumph and trial, scandal and celebration, the White House remains the enduring symbol of American democracy. Its walls hold the stories of presidents, protests, and pivotal decisions that shaped the nation's past and continue to influence its future. If you're passionate about uncovering the forgotten stories of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the journey so far, and stay tuned, because there's so much more history waiting to be unearthed right here on Buried Truths.